Welcome! This is the second part to a 3-part tutorial series where I go through my method for designing and animating some esports graphics inside of After Effects. If you haven't caught part 1, I recommend checking it out. We made up this great system for creating noisy blurs as well as some CC toner effects, as well as a bunch of other things. But in this part we get to go ahead and animate it all. So let's dive in. So this is where we left off in the first part. We had the static graphic and all the systems kind of in place, and then we just get to animate each of the individual elements here. The first thing I'm going to focus on is the main text. So I'm just going to solo that layer by clicking on the little solo button here and just focusing on this. Now the way I wanted this to animate in is just through a nice position text animator. Nothing too crazy, and that's typically the trend when it comes to these esports graphics, is that they can look quite technical, but overall, the movements and any kind of transitions that they have are quite straightforward. So what I'm going to do is open it up and add myself a position text animator here. It's going to add an animator, and for its position, I'm going to make it come in from the right-hand side to the left. So I'm going to increase the position on the X value to around about 600 or so. And in the range selector, you'll see that by default, it's going to have a very basic kind of shape to it, where if you drag the start to from 0 to 100, you're going to get a very linear letter by letter kind of transition, and that's not what we're after. If we open up the little advanced section here, we get a plethora of other options, and the main thing that I wanted to change here is the shape. Changing it from square to ramp up means that each letter can start to animate over the top of one another, and we get more of a smoother transition. It's definitely still not ideal, but it's better. Instead of animating the start position now, because it's already kind of halfway through the movement, we have to animate the offset instead. Starting at -100 means that it's purely in that altered state where it's off to the right-hand side. And if we animate from -100 to +100, they all transition to its original state. So that's what we're going to really do here. There's some other little things that we'll tweak, but first we'll animate the offset, a keyframe on the very first frame, and another one on roughly frame 20, which is around about almost 2 seconds into it. I'm going to add another keyframe there. And this first initial keyframe is going to be set to -100. So we just get that general kind of movement. Works well with the 12 frames per second. But the main thing here is that the movement is incredibly linear, and you could try and ease these frames, but it's not going to be the result that you're after. Instead, I recommend altering the ease high and ease low to a nice high value that are also equal. 85% I think is a wonderful place to be. It seems to add this nice kind of oomph and acceleration, de-acceleration to the whole movement. Ripples in a much nicer way. That's all we really need to do for here at the moment, but the main thing that you can tell is that we still see our text. There's not really much of a transition going on here. It would be great for the letters to suddenly appear. And the initial kind of response I'd feel, the appropriate kind of response, would be just to simply add an opacity property to this text animator. Instead of it being at 100%, all the text starts at 0, and you get this nice effect. Each letter fades in, but when it comes to esports, it seems like the idea of that kind of smooth transition when it comes to the opacity fading isn't quite what they're going after. But I've come up with a different kind of method, and I think it works really well. So I'm going to get rid of the opacity there. For this method to work, I'm going to just add in an entirely new animator. I'm going to go up to the Animate button without the first text animator selected and just select opacity. That adds in a second animator here. And instead of animating this, I'm going to go through a little bit of a different method. But first, I want to set this up so that all the properties are correct. The main thing here is that the smoothness needs to be adjusted. At the moment, if this text animator were to animate and we had this set to 0, it would fade just like we had before. But under this square shape here, it allows us to modify the smoothness of this text animator. If we drop this down to 0 instead and we adjust the opacity down to 0, it means that when we alter the start, all the letters just suddenly appear rather than fading on, which is going to be really nice for that kind of sudden appearance for this text animator. Now we could try and animate the start property to be in time with that first initial text animator, but if we want to alter it later on, it's just going to be more keyframes to have to manage. So this is where an expression on the start property here, linking it to the original text animator, is going to be very nice. I'm going to add an expression to the start property by alt-clicking on the stopwatch here, brings up all this, and I'm going to just backspace that up. The function that we're going to be using in this expression to link it to another property is called the linear function. And the first property that we have to assign in this function is a property that we are looking at. At the moment, we want it to be referencing the offset. So I'm going to click off for a moment. It's going to shoot out an error message just to reveal that offset property in our timeline. Diving back down to the expression, I'm going to put my mouse cursor in between those two brackets, and then using the little pick whip that is down here by all these other expression controls, not the one in the parent and link column here, I'm going to pick whip the offset property, just bringing it up so we can start to scroll, and that just brings in all the necessary complicated text to fulfill that. Now the range that we want this text animator to be referencing off, that's the idea behind this linear function. We can specify a range for it to look at in this offset property, and then we get to replicate our own range in the start property. The offset is a little bit finicky in that kind of, it starts at negative 100 but goes to positive 100. But the range that we are after here today is just that little middle portion where the text is appearing halfway. Each letter is about halfway point. And that turns out to be negative 50 to positive 50. So not the full range, but definitely part of it. And it's mirrored on both sides. And what we want that negative 50 to positive 50 being mapped to the start property is 0 to 100. So we just get to animate the entire text in the start second text animator. Clicking off was a bit complicated to try and explain, but you'll be able to see that when the offset is at positive 100, the text animator in the second text animator is also at positive 100. Even if we start to reduce the value of this text animator to 50, you'll see that it's still set to 100, but as soon as we start to go up a little bit higher, the text animator, the second one at least, starts to reduce. And you can see that that is in tandem with the first text animator. The great thing about this now is that each letter appears at the midway point of that first original text animator, and you get this really cool slick effect. And that's all being driven by these two keyframes and these two text animators, and I think that is really neat. This is stuff that you can tweak around, and if you move this around to make it a bit longer, the other expression, the other text animator is automatically keeping up to speed with it. So I'm just going to pull that back down, maybe to around about maybe 14 frames or so. We can see how that looks. Makes it a bit more prompt. Yeah, that looks nice. One thing to note, of course, is that there's a lot of time wasted at the very start of this animation where it's going from negative 100 to negative 50. None of the text is visible yet, but it's still going through each of those frames waiting to be able to draw something. So what I can really recommend is instead of starting at negative 100, just changing this to negative 50, which means that the very next frame, text is going to start to reveal itself. And it gives you a better representation of when your text actually starts to animate and starts to become visible. Looking great. Now with this system set up, we can just copy and paste this onto the other text that we have currently, which is the welcome to the text that we have just above this title. Well, I'm going to ripple these up, and I'm just going to select both of these text animators and hit Control C or Command C if you're on a Mac. I'm going to take my time indicator to the very start of the project, and I'm going to isolate the welcome to the text and solo that as well, so that we just get to solo things bit by bit as we start to animate them. I'm going to hit Control V or Command V if you're on a Mac, and the text animators get to be put in with the first keyframe being where our time indicator is at. The one thing that I do want to change is instead of adding in letters, which can be a little bit chaotic with so many of them, especially with that position property that we've currently got set up, is I'm going to change it so it's based upon words instead. Going into the range selector, into the advanced, I get to change them the based upon to words instead. I'm going to go down to the second text animator and do the same thing there. Characters to words. I'm also going to reduce the position amount because 600 is a bit ridiculous for such tiny little text. So I'm going to change the position to like 125-ish, I think. And that just makes it a little bit less dramatic. You can totally play around with the timing of this too to make it a bit more punchy, so it's a bit more like welcome to the Melbourne Major, but this is fine for as is at the moment. The next thing on our list to animate is going to be the corners. And we spent a fair bit of time in that first part setting this up to be in a system that is really easy to animate. And now we get to reap the benefits of that. I'm going to solo the corners layer too, so we get to reveal them in our composition. Open up the layer, hunt down that trim paths effect that we had applied, and add a keyframe to the start property at 0 seconds. I'm going to take the time indicator quite a bit of ways forward to around about the 4-second mark just to have that really slowed out kind of movement. I'm going to add another keyframe. Now I want this to be quite exaggerated at the start. It's going to be very quick, so I'm going to just increase or decrease the value. So it's around about 44.5 at this point. It's going to be very large, but something again that we can tweak later on. And this last frame that we've got here, I'm just going to dial that up to like 49-ish or something like that, just so they're quite small, maybe even a bit smaller than that, 49.5. It's just a nice little accent around. Now, of course, just having these set to linear keyframes are going to look very dreadful at the moment. But we can utilize the graph editor inside of After Effects to fine tune this a bit. So I'm just going to select the keyframes on this start property and then click on the graph editor button in the top right of our timeline view. This brings up this kind of somewhat complicated panel. I'm just going to make sure I'm on the value graph by clicking on this little button next to the eye and selecting value graph. It just makes it a bit easier in this case. The movement that I'm after in this piece throughout a lot of these different assets is going to be a very quick start to a very slowed out and gradual finish. The way that we can achieve that is by going into this graph editor, holding down the Alt key so you get this two-sided triangle, you could almost say, and dragging up to grab one of these handles. I'm just going to pull this one very vertically at the moment so that you can see that it's going to hit from 45 to 46 quite quickly as it goes across. I'm also going to accentuate the other side as well by pulling out the handle as well by holding down Alt on the keyboard. That's Option key for all you Mac people. And it means that we have this very slick curve going on here. It also means that it's a very quick send off and very gradual finish to the whole piece. Something that looks like that should work very well for the rest of this animation as well. One of the systems I like to put into place is using nulls to drive the larger, more broad movements to this piece, and then just utilizing parenting to tag what I want to move with that specific null. Going up to the very top of our composition for a moment so we can see when we introduce layer, new, and a null object, we can see that pop in at the very top here. I'm just going to call this midground null. We're going to have 3 different nulls for a foreground, midground, and background, and it's going to help drive all of these different movements quite efficiently. The 3 things that are going to be parented to the midground null here are the things that are currently visible. The welcome to the text, the corners text, as well as the Melbourne major text. I'm just going to parent all of those to that midground null. What we're going to do here is I'm just going to switch back to the timeline views by clicking on that same button. Now we're going to be animating the scale for this one. So I'm going to hit S on the keyboard, and it's a really handy property to animate since it's center to the entire composition. Everything that's a child of this null is going to be also scaling from the center. I'm going to initiate keyframes on 0 frames and then another one at around about, again, 20 frames or so in. I'm going to go back to that first keyframe and change that scale from 100 to 200. So practically doubling it all. You can see now that everything scales in from the outer bounds, and right now it looks terrible in the process. Yeesh. So I recommend we replicate that kind of graph that we had made before for the corners, replicating that for the scale property here. So I'm going to just select those keyframes again, heading into the graph editor and just holding down the Alt key again and dragging out. I'm going to drag it down this time since that's going to change the value a bit more. And dragging out that other handle too. So it's going to be a very quick transition and then that gradual slow out. I'm going to duplicate this midground null. I'm going to call it foreground null instead. Now the only things that are attached to the foreground null are those 4 text layers that occupy the boundaries of the composition that we had made. And these are the 4 layers here at the very tippy top. So I'm going to select all of those and solo them so they're visible again. And making sure that if I bring up the keyframes for this layer, hitting U on the keyboard for instance, making sure that we are going to be parenting this all these text layers to the foreground to null when the null is at 100%. If you're going to be parenting it when it's at 200%, it's all going to be all kinds of messed up. So I recommend taking that time indicator, moving it to where it's 100, selecting those 4 text layers and parenting them to the foreground to null. And that means when you start to reverse, they go with it as you would expect. I'm going to change this initial keyframe for the foreground null to 250, just so we start to animate a little bit of depth to the entire scene. You can see that just by a little bit of scale change there, maybe even a little bit of a delay. You could even extend out one of these keyframes. You get to introduce these kind of layers of depth and a bit more complexity to the entire piece without it being overwhelming in the process. And I think that looks really cool there. I'm going to duplicate the midground null one more time, and we're going to call this one background null. I'm also going to drag it down so it makes a bit more hierarchical sense in the timeline here. Now the background null is going to be just responsible for those very obviously background elements, but I wanted to do a reverse of the scale. I wanted to scale up instead, so we're kind of all accumulating to one point. So I'm going to hit S on my keyboard to bring up the keyframes again, and I won't change any of these values just yet, but we will parent some things to it. Scrolling down to the very bottom, I think there's only two things we want parented to it. It's going to be the faceless void character and as well as the light spot behind them. I'm going to select both of these layers and I'm just going to point them towards the background null. Once again, recommending that you have your time indicator over the point where the null is 100% so it doesn't get all kinds of messed up. Moving back to that first initial keyframe, instead of them being all the way too close, I'm going to adjust the first keyframe here from 200% down to 50%, so it just pushes them way into the background. Nothing too bad, and we can always, again, change these later on. But the main thing that we need to adjust before we start previewing anything back is adjusting the graph editor, because it's all kinds of messed up because of the arcs that we had made. All you need to do, though, is just grab that handle for that first keyframe and just reorientate it upwards instead, since we, kind of reversed the motion of these keyframes. Bringing them up means that we get that slick movement back and forth. You can adjust the timings to how you see fit, but this is working pretty well so far. Now, the great part about having these three individual nulls and then different elements being parented to different ones means that we can move these independently. And one of the very cool things I've seen in a lot of esports graphics is this idea of just like minute little movements, erratic movements around the page. We can achieve that very easily through some simple expressions. And we can do that to the position property of each of these nulls. So I'm just going to go to the midground null for now, hit P on my keyboard to bring up the position property, alt-click onto the position stopwatch there, type in the words wiggle, and followed by 8, which is going to be the frequency, 8 times per second, which is a crazy amount, but only moving it by a maximum of 1 pixel in each of the dimensions. Finish then off with a round bracket, and everything's going to move just that little bit. We can copy and paste this expression to the foreground and the background null, adding that in, alt-clicking on each of the stopwatches and just pasting that in. Because each of these are unique nulls, they're all going to move that slightly different from one another. If I just zoom into the top left area here, you can see that once we play it, you can see that each of them are just drifting around that little bit, just on their own, no keyframes needed or anything like that. And it adds a whole bunch of kind of character and liveliness to the animations without having to do much at all. One of the aspects that I also want in this piece, which can be an absolute pain if you've already got keyframes set up like these big scale movements that we currently got, is the idea of just the steady and slow drifting of a position property or a scale property and all of that. I just wanted that the big scale can happen, but it continues to move at a very gradual rate, like you're just constantly zooming out or adjusting the focus. And that can be a huge pain when you're dealing with these complicated kind of keyframes. You've got this big movement, especially if you want to edit them, trying to nail that kind of transition to that drifting point. And I feel like I've got a much better method to dealing with something like that. What it does involve is just a new layer to begin with. I'm just going to go up to new and null object. This is just purely there for aesthetic reasons and just knowing where I need to go. I'm just going to call this new null called a controller instead. I'm going to add an effect called slider control just to help drive this effect, and I'm going to call this slider control drift. And this idea here is that we can animate this drift slider over the course of the entire animation and just simply add that value or take away that value to different properties, just like all the scale properties for these nulls. And it means that the computer is calculating what the value should be rather than us trying to painstakingly animate them inside the timeline. I'm going to go up to the very first frame here and just add a keyframe for the drift effect. I'm going to hit U on the keyboard to bring up that keyframe in my timeline with that controller selected. Going to the very end of the composition, I'm just going to add another keyframe. And I think the last value doesn't need to be much. We're dealing with scale percentages of these all these different properties, so it doesn't need to be much at all. I'm just going to have around about 4 or so. The way we go about adding this drift slider to these scale properties is quite straightforward, I feel. All we need to do is add in an expression for the scale property. I'm just going to focus on the midground null for now. And the first thing we need to do is just declare a variable, just referencing that slider that we have here. I'm going to type in the word drift, equals, and I'm going to use this little pick whip like we had used before and just point that towards the drift slider that we have just created, just referencing it and finishing that with a semicolon just to end that line. Hitting enter onto the keyboard, we now just get to take this drift value and add it to the scale property. And that's really easy to do. If we just use the word value, for instance, we get to reference exactly what our animation is already currently doing without having to do any kind of other witchcraft in the process. And we can just add in the value of the drift slider. The important thing to note here is that the drift slider is currently just one value. It's 0 all the way through to 4. And the scale property here is an array. It's two values, one for the X property and one for the Y property. So what we have to do here is just wrap it up into an array and just reference the drift value twice. Adding in a square bracket automatically puts in the end bracket, very nice of it. Adding in the word drift, comma, drift. And it means that it's just going to take whatever value the drift property is. For instance, it's number 4 at the moment. It's taking the value and it's going to be adding 4 to the X value and 4 to the Y value. Easy as pie. And it means that over the course of the entire animation, this drifting property is automatically going to transition very nicely from our current animation here that we have stipulated, as well as whatever value the slider is currently at. At the moment, it's actually reversed to what we want. So that's a very easy fix in the process as well. Just diving back into this effect, this expression, adding in a minus sign instead of that positive sign means that over the course of the entire animation, our big text is going to be just slowly and gradually scaling down. The great thing about this too is that it's so easy to modify. We can just change the value of the slider. We can make it start at end at +4 and perhaps start at -4. And it does all the maths for us without having to animate or change anything in the graph editor. It all just happens automatically, and all it takes is 2 lines in an expression. We can take this expression, copy that thing, and go over to the foreground null, locate the scale property by hitting S on our keyboard, adding an expression, and just simply pasting. Since we're using the word value instead, it's just going to reference the value of whatever property we just added an expression to, nothing to relink or anything. Awesome work. Going down to the background null, and what I want to do here is I want that kind of convergence of the layers. So what I'm going to do is add an expression to the scale property and just change this minus sign to a positive sign, a plus sign, so that they're going to keep scaling up in the way that they had originally moved. You can manipulate these keyframes as much as you like, but I love just the power that this has with such simplicity, it feels. It does involve a little bit of an expression work, but I think the amount of pain that is spared from having to deal with any kind of graph editor and this drifting kind of idea is well worth the effort. As we're chipping through each of these layers, adding in some more an animation to it all, I just wanted to take a bit of focus towards the background blur layer. I'm going to solo that so we get to experience that. And I'm just going to animate the blur radius. The idea here is we're just kind of simulating the idea of the depth of fields. The idea that this faceless void character is really far back in the background and it's going to be super out of focus. And we're going to animate the blur radius. I'm going to hit the stopwatch for blur radius and hit U on the keyboard to bring it up in the timeline. And at around about 20 frames or so, pretty much wherever background now finishes its scaling, which is going to be frame 20 in this case, but you might have something different. I'm going to add in another keyframe. And that first initial keyframe that we've got here, really out of focus, really blurred, I'm going to dial it up to around about 40 or so, and it just really diffuses the whole look. We then just mimic the easing that we've been doing for a lot of these other keyframes, selecting those keyframes, going into the graph editor, and just pulling down on these little handles to help accentuate the movement and amplify it a bit more. It's the consistency of these animations that makes the whole piece feel cohesive, and I think that's really important when it comes to any kind of really graphic design focused animation like a lot of esports animations are. Along with the background blur, I also wanted to make like a bright start to the whole piece. And that's where I was feeling like this glow layer that we have could also accentuate the entire kind of flashbang of its first appearance. Soloing that layer brings it in. You can see that we're introduced a whole bunch of lightness to the entire piece. But what we can do is on this first initial keyframe, we're going to animate both the radius and the intensity, because I feel like these two in tandem can make for some really nice effects. This one's going to last a little bit longer. We can see how it feels, but I'm going to extend it out to maybe the 3-second mark and see how it all looks, adding in some keyframes at that point. Going back to that first initial frame, we get to dial up the glow intensity to something like 3 or so, just to really start to heighten it, but also accentuating a little bit with a bigger glow radius. So it's a bit more intense, but also not just so focused in on it. And it kind of works along with that blur that we have just introduced. May not be very noticeable in the first frame, but if we just go a couple of frames in the future, we'll see that it becomes very overbearing very quickly. So it's a good time to start introducing all the other layers that we have hidden for now and seeing how it all kind of stacks up. Bringing back the directional blur at some point here, just so we can actually see it again. The camera lens blur, the blurred noise, as well as the toner effect. If you start to see this weird kind of black edge, we also need to, solo layer the background, as well as the slow atmosphere, and we start to introduce all these colors, and it starts to not look so overwhelming in the process, and bringing back the noise as well. And at this point, I think we've just soloed every single layer, completely defeating the purpose of soloing layers. So I'm just going to hit Control A and hit that solo button, so all of it just returns back to normal. The reason this is so overpowering at the moment is because we haven't actually eased out these values, and it's currently just in a very cruisy kind of fashion, animating between one state to the next. So what I'm going to recommend is we go through each of these in the graph editor, just one at a time, and pulling down on these tangents again, these little handles that we have, to help make it feel a bit more uniform with those other properties that we have animated so far. By doing this as well means that everything's going to chill out that little bit, because the values of these are going to drop off a lot sooner and not become so overwhelming. If we just play back this animation, we'll see how it all looks. It's looking really nice so far. And I think one of the other things we can do just to accentuate that kind of initial starting point is start to also animate the exposure of the light spot. Just add a bit of a focal point at the start, and it can start to transition and fade out that little bit. So I'm going to, at the 0 second mark, add an expression to the exposure effect, hit U on the keyboard to reveal it. Going forwards again, maybe to the 3 second mark, so it's in sync with the glow animation that we currently got, adding in a keyframe at that. And going to that initial kind of keyframe and dialing up that little bit brighter. 6, let's keep going, or maybe 8. Ooh, maybe not 8, 6, we'll stick with 6. And then animating the keyframes, the easing of these, just to mimic those other ones that we have made. One of the last things I also wanted to animate here, just because we've now got the power to do it and we're dealing with frames and seconds and all of this, is animating the fractal noise effect that we had set up with all these other kind of blurs that are feeding off this original effect. We get to animate the evolution of this layer and have that just feed into all the other cool effects we've got going on. If I just solo this layer for a moment, I'm going to go to the very first frame of this piece and keyframe that evolution property that we've got here, hitting U on the keyboard to reveal it again, and going to the very last frame and adding in a unknown amount so far. I may just add on about 180 degrees of rotation to the piece and see how that looks. You can see it undulate and change. It's not a good random seed at the moment. There's not enough focus towards this middle part, so we can change that. But it's a good rate of change, I think, where it's not too distracting, but there's enough evolution going on over the course of these 5 seconds. Might just change the random seed and see if we can get something a bit more dynamic here, but that looks pretty cool to begin with. See it kind of ripple around. It could be a bit too intense, but we'll find out. If we unsolo this layer and hide it again, be able to see that over the course of the animation that it evolves and undulates and changes. And one of the nice parts about animating the evolution means that if any one particular letter or one particular asset gets a bit blown out by the noisy and the blur aspect, it doesn't take too long for it to wear off a little bit and become visible again. And it's just a fantastic kind of system that happens automatically based upon just these 2 keyframes. One of the other aspects when I was first animating this piece, I wanted some kind of technical, erratic opening to this piece. It would only be like 1 second long, but it was also, it turned out, very difficult to try and summarize in a tutorial and build it up from scratch. But what I will do is show you what I came up with and then break it down with all the extra kind of techniques and effects that I used along the way. If I just play through this piece, you see that I introduced this just 1 second of kind of build up, utilizes a logo, some other technical aspects. There's a cool little grid background, some extra text, but it builds up this kind of tension to a reveal in the process. And I think it works really well. And I'll break it down for you. The main foundation for this entire kind of intro is this logo. And I made this inside of Illustrator, just utilizing a square and a couple of, cutting out edges. This logo was inspired by the Dota 2 game, but also turns out this logo looks very similar to the Apple News logo. Either way, I think it works really well, and it's enough kind of idea for the whole piece. And the way I went about animating is I animated in its own individual composition. I utilized some hold keyframes because that seems to be a very much of a trend when it comes to esports. It's erratic and it's glitchy and it looks kind of cool. I just kind of made this up on the fly. I got it sliding into position. It changes scale and rotation a little bit, up and down, back and forth, and ends with a slow zoom up. That's all it really is required at this point, and it works really well to be effective. A couple of these are just one frame changes. And you can kind of just make things up and see what feels right when you're animating it. But the real source to this whole piece, you can see here, is this unusual effect called CC scale wipe. I don't understand it, but it works really well for this kind of more dynamic and organic kind of movement that you can get here. I just animated the stretch from 1.8 back down to 0 just to reveal this logo in a more pleasing manner. It then scales down, but I'll talk about the transition and all the things that are involved towards the end. I'll focus first on all the other things that are currently going on. I also included some Melbourne text here in the background just to help kind of bring back that focus. If I just solid this layer, you'll see that it's just simply the same kind of text, but I utilized a stroke instead of a fill, which you can control up in the character font text. I animated the tracking of this layer, so all the letters are a little bit further spaced apart. The way you go about that is by adding in a text animator for the tracking. You don't actually have to animate the text animator. All you have to do is just keyframe the tracking amount, and you get to access the very nice property of separating each letter by a determined amount of space. And that's what I've got going on here with a very similar kind of easing that we've done with the previous things. It starts out very quick and starts to ease in. It also scales up over the course of the animation, and then it gets to transition off, which I'll get to explain in a moment. I've also introduced some extra corners just for the intro here. They just get to animate in very much like we have done before, but it gets to transition away and just animates out via its trim paths. But I also have these logo corners, which I think is pretty neat. I got to adapt the current system here and have them just suddenly appear around about the logo when it's finished doing its little rotation business, and it gets to kind of do the opposite scale that the logo does. It feels like it's locking in the process, and it makes for a nice little build up, and they also animate off. I added in some extra detailed text of not much importance whatsoever, just into the corners, because once again, it's kind of that build up of detail in these pieces, just more technical elements. But for instance here, I've added in a text animator, which is purely based upon opacity, set to 0. It's still set to square, and I'm just simply animating the start towards the end. But this one's going to be based upon words, but the key source here is at a randomized order, which means that they just get to appear in an erratic randomized order. And for the transition for these, it's just simply reversed. Nothing too technical there. Along with this text animator, I've also animated the tracking amount that little bit just for a bit more variance to it. It's barely noticeable at this point, but also sliding their position ever so slightly in so that it adds a bit more movement to the piece. One of the other cool aspects that I've got going on here is this grid background. And if I start to minimize all the effects that are going on with it, if I get rid of these linear wipes, I'll get to explain it from the ground up. It's also got this Luma mat going on here. It's really just a bunch of squares in the background. But the way it's set up, I think it's kind of cool. Maybe a slightly overkill, but it's one of the only ways you can do about it inside of After Effects without any kind of plugins. Utilizing repeaters, we're able to repeat this over and over again to eventually create a grid. One repeater is just to create it left to right, a whole line of these. I've currently got 50 copies, and each of these are translated by 40 pixels to the right. One other little tidbit that I can include here, just to make your lives a little bit easy, is by adding in an expression for the offset, because you really want your original square to remain in the center. What I can recommend is by adding an expression to the offset, which takes the value of the copies in a negative value and divides it by 2, which means that every time you change the value of the copies, it keeps the original one centered. And I think it's just really handy to keep things automated. Likewise for the second repeater, we're just going to take the single line and now repeat it up and down. easy enough to create a grid. Again, same kind of expression linking it to the copies, but I've also added an expression that takes the value of translation that we had stipulated in the first repeater and mimic it here, which means that if you go to the first repeater and change the X value, they all start to follow along in a very uniform manner. I've got them then revealing through the effect called a linear wipe, which is just a very basic kind of effect that just reveals and dismisses layers based upon its angle and its transition completion. I've got 2 of these so that one reveals it and the other one follows suit. And these keyframes are overlapped quite a bit in the process, and they're eased quite heavily so that you get a more gradual and slow kind of reveal. It happens very quickly in the end, only over the course of a couple of frames, but I think it's very slick. But the main effect is driven by this grid background fractal noise, because we love fractal noise here. And at the moment, it will just be using it as a luma matte. If we just reveal this layer for a moment, you'll realize that it's very similar to the other one that we had used to drive that original noisy blur. It's a fractal noise, basic, it's got some contrast, it's got some brightness, it's got a very quick evolution. You'll see that if I check out the keyframes here, it is quick to animate through. Very weird, it's undulating and all of that. The scale is not quite as large, and we've got a fast box blur over it just to help soften out all those edges. But utilizing this as a luma matte for this grid background means that when it starts to animate through, you'll see that it's very quick and it's just that extra little accent detail to the whole piece. And because this opacity is set to 30%, it's getting picked up by the CC toner as quite a dark gray, and it means that it gets this wonderful kind of purplish but dark color to the whole piece. It doesn't bring too much attention to itself in the process, but I think it looks really nice and just adds this extra detail to the background as all these other things start to move about. Now, when it comes to the transition, there's a couple of things that I wanted to note. The main thing here is I've introduced its own intro null. This one's got the position wiggle effect on it too, but there's one extra bit that I added in, is the controller for the wiggle amount. In the controller, along with the drift, I added in a new slider called Wiggle Amount, which starts off at 1 and ends at 1, but slowly starts to pick up over the course of a couple of frames to a peak of 32 pixels, and then quickly comes back down to 1 pixel. And each of these expressions have been updated so that instead of referencing the number 1, it's looking at the slider for whatever value the amount of wiggle should be. You can check out the easing that I've done for this. It's just a very quick up and back down, nothing too crazy, but it means that you get this kind of build up tension before the piece starts to reveal towards the rest of the animation. When it comes to the transition out, some things just scale down, but some other objects get to do a cool little transition away, like the original Melbourne text that we've got going on here. A really cool aspect that I've got here is using another text animator, which is again, just its opacity set to 0 with the smoothness set to 0. But I also have the start and the end properties animating. The end property is just taking the value of 100 and minusing whatever the start property is. So whenever the value changes, it's just going to be mirroring one another. When it's 8, it's going to be 92. That means that over the course of this animation, the text starts to disappear to its center instead. And I think it makes for a cool way of transitioning it out without the whole thing just fading out in the process. Other than that, I think the only really big thing that I had done is animated the glow effect a little bit so that it starts to pick up over the course of a couple of frames just to build that tension. It kind of goes with that wiggle amount and then just does what it had done prior. And there you have it. There's a whole piece kind of animated in a distinctive but cohesive style for an esports kind of animation. If you're interested in poking around, playing around, or adapting it a little bit further, we have included this After Effects template on our Gumroad, which you can download for absolutely free, and you can play around and tinker it to your heart's content. We can't include every piece of assets that we have used in this piece, but we have included some links if you do want to pursue them, like Premium Beats Slow Atmosphere, something that we can't include, but it's absolutely worth downloading the full pack for. Next up in part 3, we get to take this animation and adapt it into a powerful and robust template system where it adapts to the information that we provided. We have text that automatically changes its size based upon how much characters or letters are involved, as well as a color system which allows you to pick one color and transforms the entire CC toner effect based upon your preference. The process involved just completely changed the way that I view templates inside of After Effects. The expressions and essential graphics are just so incredibly powerful for creating these robust systems. So do consider subbing if you're interested in seeing what I have in store for part 3. And thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.